Hello everyone. Before we get started, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you. That way YouTube will share these stories with more people, even the ones who won't be able to sleep tonight. Now, let's begin. My hands were already shaking when I shoved the door shut behind me, snow falling off my jacket as I pressed my back to the wooden frame. Something had followed me from the tree line, and it wasn't the storm. I could still picture the shape moving between the pines, closing the distance faster than I could run. I hadn't even fully caught my breath when the cabin walls gave a faint tremor, like someone brushed against the outer boards. I forced myself away from the door and reached for the table where I'd left my phone, but the screen stayed black. The battery had died hours earlier. I cursed myself for ignoring that earlier warning buzz and set the phone down, listening for any sound outside. Nothing came. I didn't trust the quiet. I just sprinted half a mile through snow up to my shins, and the thing behind me hadn't moved like someone out for a walk. The cabin was part of an old rental loop outside a small mountain town. I'd booked the place thinking a winter retreat would help me regroup from a rough month, but the moment I stepped inside earlier that day, something felt off. Not paranormal, just wrong. The layout was cramped. The windows sat low, and the forest pressed right up against the back wall. I'd written it off as isolation nerves until night fell and I saw the first sign someone had been nearby. It was a reflection in the glass. Not a face, not eyes, just the faint shift of movement behind the thin curtains as I washed a mug in the sink. I'd checked outside, found nothing but my own footprints, and tried to shake it off. By late evening, I'd convinced myself it had been snow blowing across the glass. But when I stepped onto the porch an hour later to grab more firewood, a single set of prints curved out from the trees and stopped right beside the steps. They weren't mine. They weren't old either. Snow was still powdery around the edges. Someone had come right up to the railing, stood there, and turned back into the forest without approaching the door. I'd backed into the cabin slowly, keeping my eyes on the tree line. Nothing moved until I reached the threshold. That was when a figure stepped out between two narrow trunks and angled toward the slope behind the cabin. No hesitation, no stumbling, just a straight, determined path. I didn't wait to see anything else. I'd rushed inside, barred the door, and now stood gripping the back of a chair like it could anchor me. I crossed the small room toward the nearest window and stopped before touching the curtain. My breath came out in short bursts. I knew looking out might expose me if they were close, but not looking felt worse. I lifted the edge of the curtain an inch and peered through. The snow near the porch was untouched except for the tracks I'd seen earlier. Nothing new. No figure. No movement. That didn't settle me. The trees stood so tightly together that anything could hide between them. I dropped the curtain and backed away again. The stove crackled softly behind me, throwing a weak glow across the narrow room. Every shadow twitched when the flames shifted. I checked the front door bolt again, then moved to the bedroom, scanning the corners as I went. The window there sat half fogged, and I wiped a small circle with my sleeve. At first I thought I was seeing the reflection of the shelf behind me. But the shape wasn't mine. Someone was standing at the far edge of the clearing, almost blended into the dark line of trees, upright, still, facing the cabin. No coat, no hat, bare hands hanging at their sides. I stepped back, heartbeat hammering. They hadn't moved from where I'd first seen them, and yet the prints near the porch proved they'd come closer earlier. They were waiting, watching, and now they knew exactly which room I was in. I backed away from the window until my shoulders touched the wall. The figure outside hadn't moved, but the posture alone made my stomach twist. No normal person would stand motionless in freezing air without even shifting their weight. I waited a full minute, breathing slow and quiet, then forced myself to check the window again. They were gone, not walking, not turning, just gone. I stepped closer carefully, searching the edges of the clearing for any sign of movement. The snow surface looked undisturbed except for the deep prints leading from the trees toward the porch. The rest showed nothing. No new depressions, no scattered powder, nothing to explain where that person had slipped away. I left the window and paced a tight line across the bedroom, trying to keep my mind from spiraling. I needed to think about the layout, not the fear. The cabin had only two exits, the front door and a back utility door near the wood stove. There were 4 windows, all low and small. If someone wanted to force their way in, I'd hear them. That logic helped, but only slightly. I moved back into the main room and dragged a chair toward the door, wedging it under the handle. It wasn't much, but it felt better than nothing. My hands were still trembling from the sprint earlier, so I rubbed them together and forced myself to take slower breaths. The stove's warmth pressed against my back as I sat on the edge of the couch, listening for anything outside. A sound finally came, but not from the direction I expected. Something tapped lightly against the side of the cabin, far from the porch. It wasn't loud, more like the soft knock of a knuckle through wood. I froze, body rigid. The knock came again, the exact same spot, same gentle pressure, like someone testing how hollow the wall was. I crept toward the sound and pressed my ear lightly to the nearest pane. Nothing followed. The silence stretched long enough that I began to think I imagined it, but the knock had been too deliberate to dismiss. I stepped back and stared at the wall, trying to picture someone standing inches away from the boards. The next sound came from the opposite side of the cabin. A single scrape in the snow, like a boot shifting its weight. I turned toward the bedroom door, eyes fixed on the far window. The curtain there swayed the slightest bit. Not from wind, the cabin was sealed tightly, but from something brushing the exterior frame. I stepped forward slowly, watching the fabric settle back into stillness. I didn't want to look out again. I knew I had to. I lifted the curtain's edge and scanned the clearing. Nothing. The trees looked like a solid wall of black, untouched and unmoving. I leaned in closer, eyes adjusting to the pale glow cast by the snow. Then my gaze caught something near the base of the nearest trunk. A second set of footprints, new ones, fresh, leading away from the cabin, not toward it. I followed their path with my eyes. They didn't return to the clearing. They didn't curve back toward the trail I'd used earlier. They cut deeper into the forest, straight and purposeful. Whoever had been standing outside my window had walked away, but they hadn't run. They hadn't stumbled. They hadn't hesitated. I stepped back from the window, processing the disturbing shift. This wasn't someone trying to break in. This wasn't someone lost or confused. They'd come here intentionally, watched me, and then chosen to disappear back into the darkness. I returned to the main room and scanned every window again. No movement, no sound, only the muffled crackle of the stove. My pulse finally slowed, though my nerves stayed sharp. I sat down, keeping my eyes on the front door and my ears tuned to the outer walls. It felt like the danger had lifted, but the footprints outside proved one thing clearly. They were coming back. I stayed on the couch until the fire settled into a steady burn, the warm air drifting unevenly through the small cabin. I thought the stranger would return quickly, but minutes passed with nothing except the occasional crack of wood inside the stove. The longer the quiet held, the more trapped I felt. I needed to know how far the footprints went. If they circled around, if they doubled back, if they stopped somewhere close. I had to see it before I spent another night inside these walls. Every part of me knew stepping outside was a terrible idea, but staying blind felt worse. I grabbed my jacket, zipped it high under my chin, and slipped on my boots. A deep breath steadied my nerves before I unwedged the chair from the door. I paused with my hand around the handle, listening. No shifting snow, no breathing, no movement brushing against the porch. I eased the door open just enough to slip through and pulled it shut behind me. The cold hit instantly. The air felt sharper than earlier, and the clearing looked washed out under the faint sky glow. My footsteps pressed clean lines into the snow as I walked toward the tree line, retracing the path I'd seen from the window. The original set of footprints still dipped toward the porch, frozen slightly around the edges. I ignored those and followed the newer trail leading away from the cabin. The prints were spaced evenly, each step firm and direct. Whoever made them walked with confidence, not with fear or hesitation. I kept my head angled toward the forest as I followed the trail toward the trees. Branches sagged under the weight of fresh snow, and the dim light made the gaps between trunks seem deeper than they should have. My breath came out in short clouds that drifted sideways in the slight breeze. The prints continued straight ahead without curving or wandering. I counted each one as I moved, trying to track distance in case I needed to run back fast. When I reached the first line of trees, the sounds of the cabin faded behind me. I took another step, then froze. The footprints ended, not faded, not covered. They ended abruptly, as if the person stepped into the space between two narrow trunks and never stepped out. I squatted beside the final print, studying the edges. The snow hadn't been disturbed beyond that point. No drag marks, no crushed branches, no evidence of someone crouching, climbing, or stumbling. It didn't make sense. They couldn't have vanished. I scanned upward instinctively, expecting to see someone perched on a low branch, but there was nothing above except clumps of snow and dark needles. Something clicked behind me. I spun around. Nothing moved. No one stood on the path I'd taken. The cabin sat far behind in the clearing, dimly lit through the curtains. The sound hadn't come from the cabin. It had come from the side, somewhere just out of sight between the trees. I held still, waiting for another clue, A small shift in the packed snow came from the left, quiet enough that I only caught it because I wasn't breathing. I straightened slowly and backed toward the open clearing, stepping lightly so the snow wouldn't crunch loudly under my boots. I didn't turn my back on the trees. Every inch of me stayed alert, expecting something to break through the line of trunks. Halfway back I saw it. Not a person, not movement, something much smaller but somehow worse. A second trail of footprints I hadn't noticed earlier. These weren't deep or evenly spaced. They were rushed, chaotic, cutting diagonally from the forest toward the right side of the cabin. I hadn't seen them from the window because they dipped behind a low drift before reaching the clearing. My chest tightened as I followed their direction. They stopped at the cabin's side wall, directly under the bedroom window, and they didn't return to the forest. I moved quickly toward the cabin, scanning the shadows near the foundation. Nothing hid there. No one crouched under the sill. No stray prints leading toward the back door. It was as though the person had walked straight up to the side of the cabin, stood below the window I'd been watching from, and then waited for me to move to another room. Every instinct in me screamed to get inside. I circled back toward the porch, never letting my guard drop. I opened the door fast, stepped inside, and pushed it shut with my shoulder. The lock clicked firmly into place. I wedged the chair under the handle again, breathing harder than before. I paced once from the door to the stove, trying to settle my nerves. The heat warmed my face, but my hands stayed cold. The cabin felt smaller now, like the walls pressed in tight around me. Someone out there had been close enough to hear me moving inside, close enough to watch every room I stepped into. I turned off the lights and sat on the floor beside the stove, staring at the dark windows. The fire's glow flickered just high enough to let me see their outline. At some point in the long stretch of silence, a shape moved across the far window. Not a full silhouette, just a shift of shadow passing slowly along the outer wall. They had come back, and this time they weren't watching from the trees. They were circling the cabin, searching for wherever I wasn't looking. I stayed pressed against the stove until the footsteps outside came to a stop beneath the front window. The shadow held there for several long seconds before turning sharply toward the trail that led back to town. I didn't move until their shape dissolved into the tree line. When daylight finally pushed through the curtains, I opened the door and stepped out to frozen silence. A single trail of prints cut away from the cabin and disappeared into the forest, each step spaced farther apart, as if the person never looked back. I locked the cabin behind me, walked down the path without stopping, and didn't turn around even once. I slammed my shoulder into the back door the moment I heard the crash from the workshop. Tools clattered across the concrete, and something heavy rolled until it struck the far wall. I didn't know who had broken in, only that they were close enough for the sound to rattle the thin windows of my uncle's house. I locked the deadbolt and stepped away fast, pulse racing as I stared through the narrow kitchen entry. The workshop sat just a few yards behind the house. I'd gone out there earlier to stack a few boards and shut off the heater. Nothing had been out of place then. No reason for anyone to be inside. Now something was moving around with deliberate force, shifting weight across the floor in slow, steady steps. I ducked beside the counter and listened. The steps paused, followed by a soft drag of metal over wood, like someone sliding a long bar across a table. I didn't recognize the sound, but it was too controlled to be an accident. Someone wasn't just rummaging, they were choosing. I crept across the kitchen and peeked through the window above the sink. The yard lights barely reached the workshop, leaving the structure in deep shadow. The door hung open at an angle I hadn't left it in. A faint line of light spilled from the interior, cutting across the snow. Nothing moved in the doorway. I ducked again and tried to steady my breathing. My uncle would be back in the morning, and I'd only agreed to house sit because he'd insisted it was quiet out here. He wasn't wrong. The small town barely had traffic. The nearest neighbor sat a quarter-mile down the road. But that didn't help me now. Another heavy object rolled inside the workshop, slower this time, not dropped, guided. I needed to know whether the person inside had seen me come back earlier. If they had, staying in the house might trap me. If they hadn't, I might still have a chance to slip out through the front door and reach the road. I crawled toward the living room, keeping low beneath the windows. The wooden floor creaked lightly under my knee, and I froze. The workshop noise stopped instantly. The silence that followed was sharp enough that I felt it under my skin. Whoever was in there had heard something. I held still, barely breathing. A moment later, the workshop light shifted like someone moved past it. A boot scraped against concrete. Another step. The cadence changed, no longer searching, now heading directly toward the doorway. I rose slowly until I could see the yard again through the side window. The open workshop door stayed still. No silhouette. No movement. Then a figure emerged, stepping into the dim spill of the yard lights. Tall, coated, hood up, both hands at their sides. They didn't look at the house right away. They scanned the yard first, sweeping their gaze across the bare patches of snow where footprints would show clearly. That was when I realized something chilling. My tracks from earlier still pointed straight to the workshop. Anyone coming out would know I had been inside at some point. The figure turned toward the house. I ducked instantly, sliding behind the couch, gripping the edge with both hands to keep myself steady. My heart thudded harder with each passing second. The front steps were old and the slightest weight would make the boards shift. I waited for that sound, braced for it. Nothing came. I listened harder. The yard stayed silent. The workshop door creaked faintly as the wind nudged it wider. I risked lifting my head just enough to see the window again. The yard was empty. The figure had moved out of sight, either toward the side of the house or... A soft tap touched the window above me. Not a knock, a fingertip. Slow, deliberate. I slid lower, pressing myself flat against the floor as the shadow on the curtains stretched across the glass. Whoever stood there wasn't trying to force entry. They were checking each window, mapping the house one room at a time. I stayed pressed to the floor until the shadow drifted away from the window. I didn't hear footsteps leaving, only the faint shift of snow as weight settled somewhere along the wall. I crawled toward the hallway, careful not to brush against the furniture. The house felt too quiet, like the walls were waiting for the next sound to reveal where the intruder moved. At the corner, I stood slowly and peeked around the frame toward the front entry. The curtains there hung still, no shape pressed against the glass. I reached for the light switch, then pulled my hand back. Any glow inside would turn the windows into mirrors. They'd see every movement I made. I stepped backward and angled toward the bedroom. It was the only room with a door that closed fully. The lock wasn't strong, but at least it gave me a barrier. I closed the door gently, slid the latch into place and backed away from it. My uncle kept an old landline phone on the dresser, but when I lifted it, the base hummed with no dial tone. The power flickered once, the heater rattled. Then a thump landed against the outer wall, directly behind the bed. My breath caught as I stared at the headboard. The impact wasn't loud, but it was too firm to be accidental. I took 2 steps toward the corner of the room and crouched beside the dresser, keeping my eyes fixed on the wall. Another thump came, lower this time, like someone tapping the foundation with their boot. I edged toward the window and peeled back a sliver of curtain. The yard stretched empty. The workshop door swayed in the wind. I couldn't see anyone near the house, but that didn't mean they weren't pressed against the wall just out of view. The next sound shifted position. This time it came from beneath the window, a soft brush of fabric against siding. My pulse jumped hard, and I dropped the curtain immediately. They were checking heights now, probing from ground level up to the window frame. I backed deeper into the room and scanned for anything that could help if the door failed. The only usable item was a heavy metal lamp from the nightstand. I unplugged it and gripped it in one hand. The latch on the bedroom door clicked lightly. Not forced, not rattled, tested. I held my breath. The handle turned a fraction before stopping, like the person outside was checking for movement inside. I tightened my grip on the lamp and kept silent. After a long pause, the handle released. The faintest shift of floorboards came from the hallway. They were walking slowly, listening for any reaction from inside the room. I moved to the opposite side of the bed and knelt beside the frame, keeping the wall between us. The footsteps drifted toward the living room, each step careful and measured. Whoever this was, they knew how to move without giving much away. That scared me more than the break-in itself. They weren't panicked. They weren't rushing. They behaved like someone who had done this before. The footsteps paused again, this time near the kitchen. A cabinet door creaked open. Another followed. Metal clinked faintly, utensils shifting. They were looking for something. I pictured the drawers in that room, tools, kitchen knives, odds and ends my uncle never organized. If they found something sharp, the situation would shift fast. I pushed myself into a low crouch and leaned toward the door, listening for where the intruder went next. The sound of a drawer closing drifted down the hall. Then another. The footsteps stopped again. A moment later, the back door handle rattled hard. I flinched, realizing the intruder wasn't trying to leave. They were testing every exit, mapping the house from the outside and the inside. I stepped closer to the window again and lifted the curtain edge with trembling fingers. The yard was still empty, the workshop still half lit, the fence still buried under snow. But when I lowered the curtain and turned toward the room, something new hit me. The hallway was silent. Too silent. They weren't checking doors anymore. They were standing still, listening for me instead. and they were closer than before. I held my breath and focused on the door, waiting for the next sound. The silence stretched so tightly that every second fed the tension instead of easing it. I shifted my weight slowly, keeping the lamp raised, and leaned an inch closer to the door frame. If they were in the hallway, I needed to know their position before they tried anything. A floorboard creaked lightly near the living room, not from heavy steps. This was a controlled shift of weight, like someone testing how much sound the house gave with each move. I backed toward the dresser again and crouched beside it, positioning myself where the intruder wouldn't see me immediately if the door opened. The next sound wasn't a step. It was a slow inhale from the far side of the wall outside, barely audible through the thin structure. It didn't sound like someone catching breath after running. It sounded like someone steadying themselves. My grip on the lamp tightened. They were close again, either inside or outside, but I couldn't tell which. The heater clicked on, and the sudden hum masked the subtle noises. I pressed my ear to the floorboards to regain any clue. Nothing at first. Then a faint vibration traveled through the wood. Not footsteps, weight shifting directly against the side of the house. They were leaning against the exterior again, right near the bedroom. I moved to the window and lifted the curtain slowly. Snow covered the yard in a flat sheet, untouched except for the same footprints from earlier. No new prints broke the surface. Whoever pressed against the wall was careful not to disturb the snow line. I lowered the curtain and backed toward the center of the room. If they were outside, they couldn't get in easily. If they were inside, I needed to know exactly where. My heart raced as I leaned toward the door, listening again. A soft click echoed from the hallway. Not the front door, not the back door, the bathroom. The handle had turned. I swallowed hard and stepped away from the door, realizing the intruder hadn't left the house at all. They'd slipped into the bathroom when the heater noise covered their movement. The room had only one small frosted window that barely opened. They weren't hiding, they were trying to reposition. The door across the hall creaked open slowly. I braced myself. The bathroom door eased wider, stopping halfway. No shadow crossed the hallway. No sound followed. The hesitation startled me. Whoever this was understood how to use silence to their advantage. I edged to the far side of the room, moving so quietly it felt unnatural. My fingers ached from gripping the lamp. Another faint creak sounded from the hallway as a foot shifted its angle. They were standing just out of sight, waiting to see if I reacted to the open door. When I didn't move, the floorboard creaked again, this time closer. I backed until the wall touched my shoulders. The bedroom door handle turned slowly. My chest tightened as the latch slid upward a fraction. The lock held, but the intruder didn't force it. They tested it gently, confirming I was inside. The handle lowered again. Soft footsteps moved back down the hall toward the kitchen. I followed the sound from the far side of the room, careful not to step anywhere that might give away my location. A drawer opened. Another followed. Metal shifted inside. They were searching again, this time not for an exit, for something they could use. My stomach dropped when I realized what drawer they were opening. The one near the sink held a long wrench my uncle used for repairs. It made a distinctive scrape against the wood when moved. I heard that scrape now. I inch-crawled to the window and lifted the curtain as quietly as possible. The workshop sat dark. The yard held no movement. The road beyond the fence glowed faintly under the thin snow cover. If I could reach it, distance alone would give me a fighting chance. The footsteps returned to the hallway. This time they didn't pause. They approached the bedroom directly, weight shifting with clear intent. No more testing, no hesitation. The handle turned again, firmer now. The lock strained but held. I stepped back, every muscle tensed. The intruder didn't try the handle a third time. Instead, the sound came from the living room, boots crossing the floor, heading toward the front entry. For a moment I thought they were leaving, but the footsteps stopped short of the door. They were waiting, not outside the house, not in the hall, at the only exit I could use. They knew I would try to run, and they were planning to catch me the moment I opened that door. I jolted awake to the sound of something hitting the porch railing, hard enough to shake the thin cabin wall behind my bed. I grabbed the edge of the mattress and pushed myself upright, heart thudding as I listened for a second impact. None came, just the hollow groan of wood settling and the distant hiss of wind shifting through the pines outside. I swung my legs over the floor and stayed still, trying to decide whether the noise had been part of a dream or something real. Another dull thud rattled the railing. That one wasn't imagined. I crossed the room quietly and kept low beneath the window. My uncle's hunting cabin didn't have curtains, just a single thin blind that barely covered the glass. I lifted one corner and peeked outside. The porch light flickered, dusted with snow. Nothing moved across the wooden boards. The railing looked intact, but the snow on the steps wasn't smooth anymore. Something had disturbed the top layer. I let the blind fall and backed away, forcing myself to breathe evenly. I had only been at the cabin for one night. I'd come here to clear my head after a rough semester, planning a quiet weekend before heading home. The property sat on the edge of town, not isolated enough to feel dangerous, but far enough that the nearest cabin sat behind a thick row of trees. I wasn't expecting visitors. Definitely not at this hour. I grabbed the heavy flashlight from the nightstand and moved toward the door leading to the living room. The wood creaked under my feet, and I froze immediately. The thud on the porch had been heavy. Not an animal bumping into the railing. Something else triggered it. Something with weight. I listened again, focusing on every small sound. The roof crackled occasionally from the heat inside, meeting the cold air outside. The old refrigerator hummed quietly. The stove clicked as metal expanded. Normal cabin noises. But nothing explained the repeated strikes against the railing. I crept into the living room and checked the front door. The lock was still in place. I leaned an ear against the wood. No movement on the other side. I switched my attention to the window beside it and lifted the blinds slowly. The porch lay still beneath the weak light. Snow drifted lightly across the boards. I scanned every corner, studying the shadows beneath the railing and the steps. Nothing stood there. I lowered the blind and stepped back. Maybe it was a branch falling, but there were no branches anywhere near the porch roof. I crossed the room toward the kitchen window next. The blind lifted easily, revealing the clearing behind the cabin. The snow looked untouched. No tracks. No movement. No sign someone had walked behind the cabin recently. I turned away from the window, trying to think rationally. If someone hit the railing twice, they were strong enough to create those impacts. But why stop after the second strike? Why not pound on the door or try the handle? The silence felt too deliberate. I paced between the kitchen counter and the living room doorway, holding the flashlight tight in my hand. I checked the back door next, running my thumb over the cold metal latch. Locked. Secure. A soft tap echoed from the porch window. Not a heavy thud this time, not a strike. A quick, sharp tap against the glass. I spun toward the sound, lifting the flashlight instinctively. My breath caught as I crept toward the front window again. The blind swayed slightly, like something had brushed against it from the outside. I reached for the string and held it still. The house stayed silent. Then another tap hit the glass. Close, direct, measured. Someone stood inches from the window. I stepped back fast, nearly tripping over the edge of the rug. Whoever was out there didn't try to break in. They didn't call out. They didn't move to the door. They were tapping just to let me know they were still there. Still watching, still waiting for the exact moment I made the mistake of looking out. I backed toward the center of the room, keeping my eyes fixed on the window even though I refused to lift the blind again. I didn't want my face anywhere near the glass. Whoever was outside knew exactly where I slept and exactly where I'd moved once I reacted to the tapping. The precision of it made my skin crawl far more than the noise itself. I moved to the side wall and pressed my back against it, holding the flashlight tight. The tapping didn't return. Instead, the porch light flickered again, dimmed halfway and steadied. The bulbs were old, but the timing felt wrong, like something had shifted near the railing and partially blocked the light for a moment. I edged toward the hallway that led back to the bedroom. I didn't want to hide, but I needed a vantage point where I could listen without being exposed. The living room had too many windows. The bedroom had one, but I could position myself behind the tall dresser and stay out of sight if someone tried to peer in. I slipped into the hallway and closed the bedroom door softly behind me. The latch clicked just enough to confirm it caught, but not loud enough to echo. I crossed the room and crouched behind the dresser, flashlight off, watching the faint glow from the window spill across the floor. Snow reflected just enough light that I could trace the outlines of furniture. For a full minute, nothing happened. Then the porch boards groaned, not from weight shifting in the wind. This was a footstep settling right near the window. Another step followed, measured and slow, crossing from the left side of the porch toward the front door. I pressed myself lower, bracing for the next sound. The door handle clicked. Not twisted, not forced, just touched. Someone was testing how quietly they could move the metal. I held my breath. The handle remained still for several seconds, then released gently. Snow shifted again. One deliberate step back onto the boards. Whoever stood there wasn't trying to get in immediately. They were learning the layout of the house, the same way they'd mapped the edges of the porch earlier. The heater kicked on with a low hum. I winced, realizing it would mask the smaller hints of movement. I crawled closer to the window and listened over the drone of the vents, trying to isolate every faint sound. A different noise reached me next, a soft scrape along the siding. Someone ran their hand or something long and narrow across the outer wall. The sound moved from the porch toward the side of the cabin. I pictured them slowly circling, checking each board, each seam, the same way someone might appraise a lock before deciding where to pry. I remained behind the dresser, controlling my breathing. The scrape moved farther toward the back corner of the cabin, then silence. Heavy silence. It stretched long enough that my nerves tightened with every second. The heater shut off, and the sudden quiet made the air feel heavier. Then the unmistakable sound came. Snow pressed under a slow step directly beneath the bedroom window. I didn't look. I didn't move. I stayed perfectly still as the weight settled inches from where I sat hidden. The faint shadow of movement touched the lower edge of the blinds but didn't rise above the sill. They were crouched, listening, checking for any shift inside. The snow compressed again under a second step, then another. The shape crawled along the wall toward the back door. I imagined someone tracing the perimeter at ground level, keeping low to the foundation, avoiding the windows where I could spot them. The silence returned once more, this time broader and deeper. I pushed myself up slowly, careful not to make the floorboards moan. I needed to know if they stayed near the back door or moved toward the trees. I angled toward the hallway, head low, and inched the bedroom door open enough to peer into the dark living room. The porch light flickered again, but this time it didn't dim because someone blocked it. It flickered because it had been unscrewed halfway. The porch light steadied for a moment, glowing weakly through the blinds, and I stared at it from the hallway, trying to understand what I was seeing. The screw-in bulb didn't flicker like that unless someone physically touched it. Lens and I stared at it from the hallway, trying to understand what I was seeing. The screw-in bulb didn't flicker like that unless someone physically touched it. Someone had reached up, twisted it loose, and pulled their hand back before it went out completely. They weren't trying to cut the power. They were lowering the brightness just enough to make the porch harder to see from inside. I forced myself to breathe evenly and edged into the living room, crouching low. The boards beneath the rug were less likely to creak, so I stayed on that path until I reached the wall beside the front window. From there, I leaned close to the glass without lifting the blind. I needed to hear, not see. The faint sound of snow shifting came again, but it wasn't near the porch. It was farther out, near the side of the cabin. A careful step. Then another. The intruder hadn't left the property. They were circling again, staying in the shadows where the weak porch light couldn't reach. I backed away from the window and moved toward the kitchen. The back door had a small square window at the top, just enough to give a blurred view of the yard. I approached it slowly, stopping a few feet short. The snow outside reflected soft light from the distant road, revealing a pale sheet stretching to the tree line. Then a shape crossed through it, not a full silhouette, just the shifting outline of someone passing behind the old shed. I ducked immediately, heart hammering, gripping the flashlight tight in my hand. The shed stood barely 20 feet from the back steps. Whoever moved behind it was close enough to reach the cabin in seconds. The snow crunched once more, a patient, deliberate step. I crawled toward the opposite side of the kitchen, staying below the window. The heater clicked, but the vents stayed silent. No warm air flowing. The intruder had either unplugged it earlier or found the switch outside the utility box and cut its power. The temperature was beginning to drop. I reached the archway leading back into the living room when something brushed the back door. Not a push, not a pull. A slow drag of fingers or fabric tracing the edge of the frame. I held still, staring at the doorknob without blinking. The brushing stopped. Silence returned. Then the front porch creaked. They had moved again, fast this time, circling the cabin with purpose. I crouched and crept toward the living room, sticking close to the wall. The porch boards vibrated lightly through the floor as someone shifted their weight near the door. I stayed low, watching the shadows cast by the dim bulb outside. A faint line of movement crossed the bottom of the blinds. They were standing right in front of the window. I crawled backward until my spine touched the wall beside the hallway. My breath stayed shallow, my movements controlled. Whoever this was wasn't trying to break in immediately. They were watching how I reacted, learning every sound I made, every place I hid. The porch boards creaked again, softer this time as if they stepped away. I waited. 1 second, 2, 3, no more movement. I pushed myself into the hallway and slipped into the bedroom, needing the cover of darkness to regroup. I eased the door shut and crouched beside the dresser again, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. The cold air seeped through the window frame, sharper now that the heater wasn't running. For a moment the cabin felt empty. Then something broke the stillness, a soft tap, Not from the porch, from the bedroom window. I stared at the blind, watching the faint shift of shadow along its lower edge. Slowly, the shape rose, inch by inch. Not enough to reveal a face, just enough to show someone standing close enough to fog the glass. They held there, unmoving, waiting for the slightest sign I'd look back. When the shadow finally lowered from the window, I didn't wait to see where it moved. I grabbed my jacket, slipped through the bedroom door, and crossed the living room without looking back. The moment the porch boards fell silent, I unlatched the front door and sprinted into the clearing, running until the cabin shrank behind the trees. When I reached the road, I didn't stop. I kept moving through the cold, breath burning in my chest, until the first porch light of town came into view. Only then did I look over my shoulder, and the cabin sat dark in the distance, quiet, still, and empty, as if no one had ever stood outside its windows at all.